The new front line of global economic power, what's unfolding in the Caribbean right now, is not just another regional dispute. It's a seismic shift in the architecture of global economic power, one that will send shockwaves through energy markets, currency systems, and international trade for years, if not decades. Most mainstream analysis is missing the forest for the trees. To understand the true stakes, we need to start with facts on the ground, because military deployments are the clearest indicator of the economic interests at play. The United States has stationed over 12,000 troops across nearly a dozen naval vessels in Venezuelan waters. The arrival of the USS Gerald R. Ford This is, in effect, a blockade designed to economically suffocate Venezuela. Blockades are not about posturing. They are about cutting off a nation's lifeblood. Why is this so significant? Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, 303.8 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia, Canada, or Russia. That's about 18% of the world's known reserves. Yet, Venezuela's oil production has plummeted from 3.5 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to just 700,000 barrels per day today, an 80% collapse. The last thread holding Venezuela's oil sector together was Chevron's permit to export Venezuelan crude, which the Trump administration revoked on November 24, 2025. Chevron's technical expertise and capital were the only things keeping the country's oil infrastructure from total collapse. Without them, production could fall another 30–40% within a year. But the U.S. didn't stop there. A sweeping 25% tariff was imposed on all goods imported from any country that buys Venezuelan oil. This isn't just about punishing Venezuela, it's about punishing anyone who does business with them. India and China, the main buyers of Venezuelan crude, have been importing at steep discounts. India at about 200,000 barrels per day, China at 400,000. Both economies are deeply reliant on affordable energy imports to keep their manufacturing sectors competitive. If they bow to you, pressure and Venezuelan oil, they'll have to scramble for alternative suppliers, driving up prices in an already tight market. If they defy the U.S. and keep buying, they face a 25% tariff on all exports to America, a market worth $78 billion annually for India and over $500 billion for China. This is economic warfare on a scale not seen since the 1970s oil embargo. The choices for India and China are stark: accept higher energy costs and lose manufacturing competitiveness, or accept massive tariffs and risk being priced out of the U.S. market. Let's look at the oil market itself. Brent crude is trading around $87 per barrel, West Texas Intermediate at $83. Global spare capacity, the oil that can be brought online quickly, sits at about 3 million barrels per day, or 3% of global demand. When spare capacity drops below 5%, price volatility spikes. If Venezuelan output drops by another 300,000 barrels per day and India and China are forced to compete for other supplies, oil could easily surge to $120, $140 per barrel within 6 to 9 months. Every $10 increase in oil prices shaves about 0.2 percentage points off global GDP growth. Sustained $130 oil could cut nearly a full percentage point from global growth. For the U.S., higher oil prices act as a regressive tax. Every 1 cent increase in gasoline prices costs American consumers about $1.44 billion annually. If crude jumps from 80 to $130, retail gasoline could soar from E3.30 to over E5 per gallon, draining $250–300 billion from consumer spending. But energy prices are just the start. Deploying 12,000 troops and a carrier strike group to the Caribbean is not cheap. Operating a carrier strike group costs about $6.5 million per day, or $2.4 billion per year. With nearly a dozen vessels in the region, the total cost could be $10 million per day, or $3 billion annually if sustained. Now, consider Russia's role. On October 27, 2025, Putin ratified a strategic partnership treaty with Venezuela. Russian lawmakers have openly discussed providing advanced missiles to Venezuela, including the Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile, which can reach most of the continental U.S. from Venezuelan territory. Why would Russia take such a risk? Because Venezuela is an economic asset in Russia's confrontation with the West. Russian oil exports have been heavily sanctioned since the Ukraine invasion, forcing Russia to redirect exports to Asia, especially India and China. If the U.S. chokes off Venezuelan oil, Russia becomes the logical alternative supplier. By supporting Venezuela militarily, Russia ties down U.S. resources, gains leverage in Ukraine negotiations, and positions itself as a critical energy supplier to the world's largest growth markets. China, for its part, has been diversifying away from Middle Eastern oil, increasing purchases from Russia, Venezuela, and Iran, often at steep discounts. Venezuelan crude has been selling for 30–40 below Brent, saving China about $150 million per day on its 400,000 barrel import. But there's a deeper strategic layer. China holds over $800 billion in U.S. treasuries. If the U.S. slaps a 25% tariff on all Chinese goods because China keeps buying Venezuelan oil, China could retaliate by dumping treasuries, devaluing the yuan, or accelerating the use of yuan in global trade. This last point is crucial. For decades, oil has been priced in dollars, giving the U.S. enormous structural power. But if sanctioned producers start accepting yuan, and if India and Russia expand rupee-ruble trade, we could see the beginning of a true alternative to the petrodollar system. The domino effect, currency, trade, and economic fallout, the economic implications of a shift away from the dollar are staggering. The dollar currently accounts for about 59% of global foreign exchange reserves. If that share drops to 50% over the next decade, central banks worldwide would hold $600 billion less in U.S. assets. That's $600 billion in demand for treasuries that disappears in a market where the needs to borrow nearly $2 trillion annually just to cover its deficit. Even a 10% drop in foreign demand could push interest rates significantly higher. Let's run a scenario. Current 10-year treasury yields are around 4.4%. If foreign demand drops by 10–15% due to de-dollarization, yields could rise to 5.56%. Every 1 percentage point increase in the 10-year yield adds about $400 billion to federal interest costs over a decade. That's an extra $500 billion in debt servicing before considering the knock-on effects. Higher treasury yields mean higher mortgage rates, higher corporate borrowing costs, and higher state and local government financing costs. The 30-year fixed mortgage rate, now around 7%, could climb to 8.5%, freezing the housing market as buyers are priced out and existing homeowners with low-rate mortgages have no incentive to sell. Returning to Venezuela, the Trump administration's designation of Maduro and Venezuelan officials as members of the Cartel de los Soles foreign terrorist organization on November 24, there's a major escalation. This move criminalizes not just government-to-government relations, but any economic activity that could benefit the Venezuelan government. Any company anywhere in the world that does business with Venezuela could face prosecution under U.S. law for material support of terrorism. The chilling effect on trade is immediate and severe. Venezuela imported about $12 billion in goods in 2023, mostly from China, Turkey, Brazil, and Europe. If those companies face criminal liability, Venezuela's import capacity collapses further. The country's economy has already shrunk by about 75% since 2013, with GDP falling from $337 billion to $97 billion. Hyperinflation peaked at over 1,000,000% in 2019 before dollarization brought some stability. But with imports collapsing and oil output declining, renewed inflationary spirals are likely. When economies collapse this severely, mass migration follows. Venezuela has already seen the largest refugee crisis in Western Hemisphere history, with over 7.7 million people fleeing since 2014, more than a quarter of the population. If conditions worsen, another 2-3 million could try to leave. Colombia has already absorbed 2.9 million Venezuelan refugees. Panama is a major transit route, and Mexico is seeing increased flows, with many ultimately heading to the U.S. The economic cost of this migration is enormous, both for host countries and for Venezuela, which loses its most productive citizens. Now, consider the economic impact of military conflict. If the U.S. strikes Venezuelan military targets or attempts a broader intervention, oil markets would panic. We saw this during the Gulf War in 1990-91 when oil prices doubled in weeks, and again in 2003 with the Iraq invasion. A conflict involving Venezuela would be different because of its strategic location. The Caribbean is a vital transit route for global commerce. About 12% of global seaborne oil trade and 15% of U.S. petroleum imports pass through the region. If it becomes a conflict zone, shipping insurance rates could jump from 0.1% to 2-3% of cargo value. For a 500,000 barrel oil shipment worth $43 million, 2% insurance premium adds nearly $900,000 to the cost, which gets passed directly to consumers. Shipping costs from the Gulf of Mexico to East Coast refineries could double or triple overnight. Venezuela's military capabilities are not negligible. It has 21 operational Sukhoi Su-30 fighters, which can be armed with supersonic Kh-31A anti-ship missiles designed to target naval vessels. Venezuela also reportedly has Russian Pantsir-1 and Buk M2 air defense systems. If Russia provides more advanced missile systems, like the Caliber cruise missile with a range of 2,500 km, every U.S. Navy vessel in the Caribbean could be at risk. The USS Gerald R. Ford alone carries over 4,500 sailors and cost $13.3 billion to build. Losing even one major vessel would be an economic and strategic catastrophe. This is precisely why Venezuela and Russia are emphasizing these capabilities to make the cost of intervention prohibitively high. From a game theory perspective, both sides are locked in a commitment problem. The U.S. has deployed massive resources and issued ultimatums. Backing down would be seen as weakness. Venezuela, with Russian backing, has its own credibility at stake. If it capitulates, Maduro's government likely falls and Russia loses a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere. The current standoff is costing the U.S. about $10 million per day in direct military expenses, $3.7 billion annually. But the indirect costs, higher oil prices, reduced trade, increased migration, are likely 10, 20 times higher. The total economic impact could easily reach $40–70 billion annually if the situation drags on, and it likely will, because neither side can afford to back down without achieving core objectives. The U.S. wants regime change in Venezuela, or at least a realignment away from Russia and China. Venezuela wants survival, sanctions relief, and access to global oil markets. Russia wants to maintain its strategic partnership and use Venezuela as leverage in broader negotiations over Ukraine and European security. China wants stable, affordable energy and doesn't care who governs Venezuela as long as the oil keeps flowing. India is caught in the middle, balancing its growing partnership with the U.S. against its need for cheap energy. Endgames, global lessons, and the future of economic conflict. Let's examine the possible endgame scenarios and their economic consequences. The U.S. successfully pressures regime change in Venezuela through military, economic, and political means. A new government normalizes relations with Washington and begins rebuilding the oil sector with American and European investment. Venezuelan oil production could recover to 2.5 million barrels per day within 5–7 years, adding 1.5 million barrels to global supply and potentially lowering prices by $10, $15 per barrel. The U.S. gains a friendly government in Caracas, Russian influence is expelled, and American energy companies access the world's largest oil reserves. But rebuilding Venezuela's oil infrastructure would require around $100–200 billion in investment over a decade, with investors demanding high-risk premiums. If oil prices fall due to renewables, those investments may not make sense. The standoff becomes a frozen conflict, like Cuba for decades. Sanctions remain, Venezuelan oil production keeps declining, and the country becomes more dependent on Russia and China. Oil prices stay high, migration continues, and U.S. military spending persists. The economic drag on the U.S. is persistent but manageable, perhaps 0.2–0.3 percentage points of GDP growth lost annually, but over a decade, that's $500–700 billion in lost growth. Russia and China strengthen their positions in Latin America, and the trend toward de-dollarization accelerates as more countries seek to avoid U.S. sanctions. Military escalation. The U.S. launches broader strikes or a limited intervention. Venezuela, with Russian support, retaliates against U.S. vessels or regional allies. The conflict escalates into a regional war involving Colombia, Brazil, and possibly others. Oil prices spike to $150–200 per barrel. Global growth contracts by 2–3 percentage points, and the U.S. faces simultaneous crises in Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. The federal deficit explodes as military spending surges and growth collapses. Realistically, Scenario 2 is most likely. Neither side wants full-scale war, but neither can back down without unacceptable losses. We're heading toward a protracted economic siege of Venezuela, with Russia and China providing enough support to prevent total collapse, but not enough to restore prosperity. The Caribbean becomes another zone of great power competition, with all the associated costs and risks. For global markets, this means several things. First, oil volatility is here to stay. Any resolution is years away, so the risk premium on oil prices remains high. Energy-intensive industries must plan for sustained higher costs. Second, de-dollarization accelerates. More countries will seek alternatives to dollar-based trade to reduce vulnerability to U.S. sanctions. Third, global defense spending rises as countries realize that economic interdependence does not prevent great power competition, it just changes the battlefield. The broader lesson is that we've entered an era where economic policy and military strategy are inseparable. Sanctions are weapons, trade policies are tactics, and currency systems are strategic assets. The post-Cold War belief that economic integration would reduce conflict has been proven wrong. Instead, integration created vulnerabilities that can be exploited, and we are watching that exploitation in real time off Venezuela's coast. For investors, this environment demands a fundamental reassessment of risk. Geographic diversification is no longer enough when conflicts can disrupt global supply chains. Currency diversification becomes essential as the dollar's role is challenged. Energy security shifts from a nice to have to a critical requirement for any major economy. The Venezuela crisis is a preview of conflicts to come. As climate change disrupts agriculture, as water becomes scarce, and as critical minerals for technology become strategic assets, we'll see more situations where economic interests and military power intersect. The costs measured in lost growth, higher defense spending, and missed opportunities for cooperation will be in the trillions. What we are witnessing is not just about Venezuela. It's about the rules of the global economic system being rewritten through confrontation, not negotiation. However, this particular crisis resolves, the process will define the economic landscape for decades to come.